You think medieval holiness meant gentle prayers and safe candles? Think again. Imagine a young woman stepping into a stone cell as priests chant the office of the dead, her own funeral, while masons brick the door. This wasn't myth. Julian of Norwich lived enclosed with only narrow windows. At Cher, Christine Carpenter was threatened with excommunication when she fled. By the end, you'll smell wet mortar, hear iron trowels, and feel the walls closing. This isn't piety in lace. It's a pact with stone, ready to meet the women buried alive for God right now, but let's plunge into the twisted truth. The funeral comes first. Before an anchoress ever breathed her new life, the church staged her death. Picture the scene. The bishop presides, candles sputter, and the office of the dead is sung as if over a corpse. She steps into a cell, sometimes over a symbolic grave, and the doorway is sealed with stone. From that moment, she is legally alive, but socially dead, counted as a living saint who has left the world. The shock isn't blood. It's liturgy and masonry turning a woman into a relic while she can still hear the choir. Here's the twist. This rite wasn't rumor. Sources describe an enclosure ceremony that mirrored a funeral, and Norwich tradition is blunt. Julian's seclusion included funeral psalms, then the wall. Communities called it holy. Families cried. Masons got paid. But the real horror was still to come. Once the stones cooled, there was no door handle, no key, no casual visit home. Today we'd call that irreversible confinement. Back then, it was piety with a construction crew, and the town cheered because a living tomb meant a permanent prayer machine beside their altar. Listen, can you hear the shovel in consecrated earth? The cell wasn't a room. It was a vow poured in lime and sand. The cell is smaller than your bathroom. Think roughly 100 square feet, rough stone sweating in winter, air like damp linen. 3 openings pierce the wall like wounds. One faces the altar, a hagioscope, so she can watch Mass and receive communion. A second opens to the street for counsel, alms, and the constant drip of village gossip. A third, an even smaller wicket, lets a servant pass bread, water, and remove waste. Some anchor holds had a latrine or a scrap of garden, but many did not. Body waste? A chamber pot, emptied through that wicket. Odor? Permanent. And yes, there was sometimes company. The only animal Ancrene Wisse permits is a cat, mouser, and confidant in one purring breath. But here's the twist. Those windows weren't escape hatches. They were leashes. You can see, speak, and serve, but never step outside. Today we'd call that a life behind glass, like being an influencer trapped in a storefront. Back then, it was a human reliquary running on bread, water, and prayer, and the town lined up at the grill. The cell creaks with each season. Frost blooms on the sill. Summer flies thrum against the mesh. Wax smoke stains the arch. She learns every footstep as sound. Boots of the reeve, the clatter of the miller's wife, the whisper of penitence. Because for her, the world exists only in echoes. Prayer isn't a feeling here. It's a schedule that grinds bone. An anchoress keeps the hours like iron bells. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, then more prayers besides. The Ancrene Wisse alone stacks roughly 4 hours of set devotions each day, before you add Mass through the window, private petitions, and whispered psalms for anyone who knocks. Food is fuel, not comfort. Bread goes stale on purpose, fasting cuts deep, and a hair shirt rubs the ribs raw. Hands mend altar cloths or copy scraps of scripture by candle nubs until the wax burns skin. Here's the twist. This isn't retreat. It's labor. The anchor hold is less spa, more factory, producing intercession for the living and the dead hour by hour. Today we'd call that emotional outsourcing. Send your guilt to the cell, get prayers in return. But the real weight is physical. Cold attacks joints, smoke gnaws lungs, years of kneeling raise hard calluses like prayer stones under the skin. And when the village sleeps, the little window glows, one square of stubborn light, because somebody chose to stay awake with Gyumur. Dawn hits as a line of gold on the dust. Midnight falls like wet wool. Her voice dries to a rasp from psalm after psalm until silence is a mercy. The cat curls on her cloak. The bell at the grill ticks like a heartbeat. Another soul, another story, another decade of the rosary paid out into the dark. The town didn't wall her up to forget her. They did it because she was useful. A permanent penitent humming with prayer at the church wall turns a village into a spiritual fortress. Patrons endow bread. Merchants send wood. Busy sinners drop coins into a slit and ask for names to be remembered at dawn. Anna Ho. Warren tracked the money and the motives. Anchorites had patrons and networks, and women often outnumbered men in these cells by wide margins, especially in England. A holy woman became the village's lightning rod for guilt and hope. Here's the twist. This wasn't just charity, it was investment. A community kept an anchoress alive so she could keep them alive, in reputation, in protection, in the imagination of God. Today, we'd call it a spiritual subscription model. You support the channel. She keeps the content flowing. Prayers for plague years, harvest failures, and treason scares. And it worked. The anchor hold sat where fear was thickest, by the cemetery and the altar, a place people crossed themselves when they hurried past, and a place they returned when the fever broke. She was invisible and yet central, the quiet heart of a town that believed stone could listen. You think enclosure erased women? Here's the real twist. It sometimes carved out freedom. In a world where marriage was contract and convents had abbesses over abbesses, an anchorage could be the one space a woman controlled. A room of her own, literally, barred, yes, but legally protected, with rules that placed even the parish priest at the window, not in the doorway. From that cell she read, wrote, advised, and refused. She set the hours, she set the terms. Julian of Norwich did theology from 100 square feet. Others stitched, copied, and counseled in spaces that kept fists and feudal claims on the other side of stone. Today, we'd call that radical privacy. Medieval people called it holiness, but the cost was savage. Freedom came welded to renunciation. No weddings, no children, no walks in spring rain. If you chose the wall, you married the wall. Communities supported this because it made visible the ideal they preached, a woman who refused the world so completely that her silence became a sermon. And if you meet the most famous voice to speak from a wall, Julian of Norwich. In 1373, at 30 years old and apparently dying, she saw a torrent of visions of Christ. She recovered, chose enclosure beside St. Julian's Church, and spent decades praying, writing, and advising through a grill that filtered faces into voices. Her book, now called Revelations of Divine Love, is the earliest surviving English work by a woman. She spoke of God as mother, of wounds as windows into love, and of a mercy so outrageous she had to hide it behind stone. Here's the twist. The world came to her. Marjorie Kempe, pilgrim, penitent, and professional troublemaker, knocked at that little window and asked whether her experiences were from God or madness. Julian counseled her with steadiness and fire. Today, we'd call this spiritual therapy through a drive-through slot. Back then, it was one of the few ways a woman's theology could circulate without being burned, and through plague waves and rebellions, the anchoress stayed. When the city howled, that window stayed open, that candle stayed lit, that voice kept saying again and again, "All shall be well." Not because life was easy, but because a cell built out of pain let a woman tell the truth without asking anyone's permission. Think that sounds romantic. Imagine spending one fevered night there when the bell rope sticks and the candle gutters. Freedom can echo like a dungeon. Not everyone lasted. In the pretty Surrey village of Cher, a young woman named Christine Carpenter entered a cell in 1329. She was enclosed with the full rite, a living funeral, and given a squint in the wall to see the altar and a quatrefoil opening to receive the sacrament. Then came the crack in the miracle. 3 years later, Christine left. Here's the twist. The church did not shrug. A letter from the papal representative to the Bishop of Winchester lifted the automatic excommunication on one condition. She had 4 months to return and be re-enclosed in the same place or elsewhere if she would not be safe there, lest she be exposed to the bites of the rapacious wolf. Read that again. Not safe in a cell? From temptation? From a man? The documents don't say. They do say that the cell at Cher still bears its telltale openings, and the parish keeps facsimiles of the papers authorizing her immuration and her forced return. Today, we'd call that coercive control wrapped in prayer. Back then, it was the price of being declared holy in public. Imagine the crowd's faces when she reappeared at the north wall, the mortar patched, the grill whispering her voice again. The parish had its living tomb back. Christine had her choice erased by stone. The rules were intimate, written in ink that reads like breath on your neck. Aelred of Rievaulx wrote De Institutione Inclusarum as advice to his own sister, telling her how to live and how to guard the threshold, what to read, whom to trust, and when to open the wicket. The 11th century monk Gosselin of Saint Bertin composed a Liber Confortatorius for Eve of Wilton, part love letter, part spiritual drill manual for a woman alone behind stone. Later, Richard Rolle wrote The Form of Living for the anchoress Margaret Kirkby, mapping a burning interior life to the fixed coordinates of a cell. Here's the twist. These texts were less about escape from the body than about training it. When to kneel, when to fast, how to use words as walls and silence as a blade. Today, we'd buy a self-help book. Back then, a woman got a guide written by a monk who knew that neighbors would tap her window at midnight, and temptation would speak her name through the grill. These were not abstract treatises. They were survival kits for a lifetime sentence chosen in the name of love. The most famous handbook, the Ancrene Vitae, began as counsel for 3 sisters in 13th century England and spread like a whispered rule to cells across the land. It told them to keep their bodies close, their voices low, and their eyes on the crucifix in the darkness. The grill is not a screen. It's a stage. People arrive in crisis. Lovers, thieves, aldermen, midwives with blood on their aprons, and they speak into darkness. Aelred's rule even advises an older woman as doorkeeper and a young maid for work inside. Because the line between counsel and intrusion can snap fast. Through that single opening, a recluse can calm a riot, end a feud, or bless a dying child's last hour. Here's the twist. The anchoress has power precisely because she has no power. She cannot leave to plot or scheme. She cannot be bribed with land. She can promise only prayer. Today, we'd call that radical neutrality, the one neighbor who cannot take sides. But the town demands performances. They want tears at their funerals, chastisements for their lusts, answers for their nightmares. Night after night, the woman in the wall becomes a mirror, shifting her voice to match the grief before her so the gossip outside doesn't crush what's holy inside. Boots stamp, coins clink. Names are whispered into her keeping like contraband. She cannot see their faces well, only the shine of eyes, so she listens for truth in breath and silence. At dawn, she sends the answers she can give, psalms and counsel, back through the grill like medicine measured by drops. Holiness has a smell. Close your eyes and breathe it. Wax smoke, stale bread, damp wool, the sharp metal tang of a tiny brazier, and the sour undertow of a chamber pot. Medieval advice books talk about prayer. They don't dwell on waste. But bodies do what bodies do. In many cells, the pot went out the wicket. In others, a narrow chute led down to a pit. Either way, she lived inches from it. Cold bit deep, lungs ached from smoke. Infection crept in under fingernails split by winter. Here's the twist. When plague burned through the city, the woman in the wall could not flee with the rich. She stayed. Today we'd call that a high-risk workplace with no hazard pay. And still they lined up at the window, bringing fever-hot hands to the grill and crying for prayer. Some anchoresses died slowly in their cells, their breath growing thinner season by season. The cat's purr, the last sound before Compline. When the bell stopped, the door was opened, not for air but for a beer. Imagine your studio apartment, then brick the door, cut the heat, and remove the bathroom. That's the baseline. And yet, to their neighbors, that suffering was currency, pain spent on behalf of the town. They believed it changed things, like weather and fate. The anchor hold made private misery into public hope. This wasn't a fringe oddity. It was a movement. Written evidence counts hundreds of anchorites across England between 1100 and 1539, women outnumbering men, sometimes by 4-to-1 in the boom years of the 13th century. Anchor holds dotted market towns and crossroads, a human archipelago inside parish walls. Here's the twist. The end came not with scandal, but with policy. When Henry VIII dismantled monasteries in the 1530s, the same tide ripped loose the little cells. Some recluses were pensioned and pushed out. Others simply vanished from records as if the wall swallowed their names. Today, we'd call it a culture shift delivered by decree, a government update that deleted a way of life. But the memory of those windows persisted, laced into place names, parish legends, and stones that still show a sealed squint if you catch the light just right. Stand in such a church at noon, and you can feel the cold seam where a voice once lived, a line of mortar running like a healed scar. In some places, the architecture remains. At Chesterle Street in County Durham, at Hartlip in Kent, and in quiet corners elsewhere, the stones still remember. The statistics are dry, the walls are not. They sweat in winter and whisper names if you press your ear against them. In crisis, the window became an oracle. When rebellion boiled or pestilence stalked the lanes, people did not storm the cell. They asked it questions. Should we move the market? Should we dig a new well? Should I marry him? Will my child live? The answer was never magic. It was the same thing every day: prayer, scripture, pattern, and the hard, loyal presence of a woman who could not run away. Here's the twist. In a world of moving powers, kings, sheriffs, mercenaries, the anchor hold's power was that it could not move. That stability felt like truth. Today we'd hire consultants and pollsters. Back then, a cobbler shut his eyes at a grill and listened to a voice that smelled faintly of wax and incense. By keeping herself out of the game, the anchoress made herself the umpire of fears. Sometimes she calmed a town. Sometimes she just let it cry where no one else could hear. Either way, the village kept showing up. The catechism at the window was relentless. Repent, make peace, bring bread to the hungry, keep watch. People left with ash on their foreheads or a psalm on their tongues, and the cell returned to silence until the next knock. Where does devotion end and self-erasure begin? From outside, a walled woman looks like triumph over sin. From inside, she sometimes looks like absence. No family of her own, no horizon, only the loud theater of other people's needs. Even the rules warn of dangers: vanity in a stream of admirers, despair in the long winters, pride in public reputation, and the slow violence of hunger passing as holiness. Here's the twist. The same cell that gave some women voices could swallow others whole. Christine of Cher ran and then returned under threat. Unknown names simply faded behind grills that had once vibrated with counsel. Today we'd flag the risk of depression, of coercion masked as consent, of institutions confusing sacrifice with control. But in the records that survive, another face keeps appearing. Women who used the wall like a shield to do dangerous work, praying for plague carts, writing theology, keeping tyrants honest by refusing their appointments and their coins. The anchor hold was a coin that could be spent two ways: mercy on one side, erasure on the other. And which one you see depends on where you're standing when the bricking up begins. The town called it sanctity. The anchoress called it her vow. History, with all our hindsight, calls it both, and asks us to listen for the voice that survives the stone. You started with a woman stepping into her own funeral. You smelled wet mortar. You heard the trowels. Now we can say it plainly. Medieval devotion could look like a living tomb. From the first bricked doorway to the last whispered prayer, anchoresses turned themselves into lighthouses of pain and hope. They stood at the edge where church met street, and they made that edge holy by staying. Think of what we have seen: the macabre theater of enclosure, funeral psalms for the living, a grave dug inside a room, a bishop sealing a door. The cell itself, barely 100 square feet, with 3 wounds in its body, one to the altar, one to the town, one to the servant's hand. The routines that strip away illusion, hours of prayer laid like stones, fasting that chews the edges of sight, cold that climbs the bones. Think of the names. Julian of Norwich, turning visions into English words a child could understand, telling a plague-struck city that mercy is stronger than plague. Christine Carpenter, stepping out and then stepping back under threat, the paperwork of grace hard as iron. Think, too, of the hundreds of unnamed women whose cells survive only as sealed squints and parish rumors. their breath and counsel absorbed into stone. Why did communities embrace this? Because it solved problems nobody else could touch. It made a public, reliable place where guilt could be spoken and grief could be held without cost. It was theater that taught, a sermon made of architecture. It let towns flatter themselves that holiness lived among them, and it gave the poor a door that never closed. Why did women choose it? Because for a few, a wall offered a kind of sovereignty the world refused to give. In an age when a daughter could be traded and a wife could be struck, the cell could be a fortress where the rules were hers. Who to admit, what to say, when to pray. The window was not a window only to the world. It was a platform, a pulpit, and a desk. But the price was brutal. Freedom was paid for with solitude. Authority was bought with hunger. Fame came tethered to a vow that you would never again feel rain on your face. And sometimes the wall won. A face that once shone in counsel dulled to silence. A hand that had blessed grew too thin to lift. Here's the real twist. When you stare long enough at an anchor hold, you stop seeing a curiosity and start seeing a mirror. We still build rooms to withdraw from a world we can't control. We still make altars of screens and grills of comment boxes. We still ask strangers for absolution. We still confuse public performance with private virtue. Today, we like to believe that choice alone sanctifies a decision. But the past suggests a harder question. What happens when communities reward a choice that hurts the chooser? The people of Cher waved the banner of sanctity while they bricked a girl into adulthood. Bureaucracy blessed it. The crowd approved. The door closed. And yet, watch that same wall in Norwich glow at night as Julian wrote lines that have steadied hearts for 6 centuries. She did not vanish. She became a voice. She shows us that enclosure need not mean erasure, that a single mind in a hard place can rewrite the weather inside a city's soul. So what do we take with us when we leave this church and step back into traffic and noise? First, awe and caution. Awe because faith can make a furnace into a lamp. Caution because institutions can dress cruelty in robes and call it holy. Second, gratitude. We have doors that open, laws that protect, and rooms we can leave whenever the air goes bad. Third, humility. If you or I had been born in 1329, the safest life available to a clever, devout girl might have been a hole in a wall. From funeral hymns sung for the living to cats permitted as the only companions. From chamber pots emptied through a wicket to letters that ordered a woman back into her tomb under threat of damnation. From statistics that chart hundreds of cells to one shining book written in a room the size of a pantry. This is the human architecture of medieval holiness. It looks like madness until it looks like courage. It looks like cruelty until it looks like survival. It looks like a prison until a voice speaks through the grill and you realize the prison keeps the world out as much as it keeps her in. Here's my question for you. What custom do we cherish now that will someday look like bricking someone we love into a perfect windowed cell? Comment the part that shocked you the most. Subscribe for more brutally honest history. Like if you're glad you weren't born in the Dark Ages. And before we close, listen once more for the trowel, the chant, the last echo as the door becomes a wall. By the time the mortar cures, a woman is praying inside, and a town is learning how to live with its own reflection.